Hello, everyone. Welcome to this next panel of UT Energy Week 2021. And this panel will be on technology pathways, fork in the road. So my name is Benjamin Leibowitz. I'm an assistant professor in the Operations Research and Industrial Engineering program here at UT Austin. And some of the questions we're going to discuss in this panel are, what are the viable and economic technological pathways to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, what's essential and what's still uncertain from a technological point of view. And then when we think about technological forks in the road, what forks have we already moved past to put us on a path to net zero emissions by 2050, and what critical forks in the road await us in the years to come? So let me briefly introduce the three distinguished panelists that you'll hear from in just a moment. So in order, first you'll hear from Vivian Lofness, who is a university professor and former head of the School of Architecture at Carnegie Mellon University. Second, you'll hear from Ryan Weiser, who is a senior scientist in the Electricity Markets and Policy Department at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And the third speaker will be Vijay Swarup, who is Vice President of Research and Development at ExxonMobil Research and Engineering Company. So just a quick outline of how this panel is going to be structured. So first, we'll have a 5-minute opening statement from each of the three panelists talking about technological change in the sectors that they focus on, followed by a structured Q&A to really get maximal dialogue among our three panelists. And lastly, we'll have a Q&A with questions submitted by the audience. So throughout this whole panel discussion, if questions come to mind, then feel free to submit them in the chat, and we'll do our best to sort of curate those questions and get to them in the time that we have. So with that, I'll turn it over to our first panelist, who is Vivian Lofness.
Thank you. I'm going to jump to presenting live with my PowerPoint in order to get a lot of ideas across in 5 minutes. Let me start by, oops, sorry, that was not the right move. No, let's see, sorry, how to advance. I don't have an advance button. Let's see what I'm missing here. Okay, I'm gonna have to advance with slides. Oh, I see what the problem is, sorry, okay. Okay, I have had the privilege of serving on the National Academy Committee with one of UT Austin's leading professors as well, where we put together a first-year report on accelerating decarbonization. The goal is to get to zero by 2050 and to find out what we have to do by 2030. The committee is from all over the country, and it's an amazing, diverse set of backgrounds that have argued through and written the following 5 technological goals. We're going to have to electrify everything. We're going to have to do deep energy efficiency and productivity for every unit of energy we use. We're going to have to produce carbon-free electricity. We're going to have to expand the innovation toolkit, and we're going to have to build critical infrastructures. We also have socioeconomic goals that are in parallel to this. We want to strengthen the economy. We want to support communities, businesses, and workers, promote equity and inclusion, and maximize cost effectiveness. I'm representing the building sector, and I have a particular message I want to get across to you. For some reason, there are thousands of pie charts like this on a Google search. And you'll notice that buildings, the little orange wedge there, is nominal, it's tiny. And the reason it's tiny is not because buildings aren't 40% of the energy problem, but because all their electric use is handed over to the electric power wedge, which is not an end-use sector. It's not where you're using the electricity, it's where you're producing it. So if you start to look at where we're using the energy, buildings are 32% of the problem, actually greater than transportation and industry. And if you add in the actual materials that we use in construction, which is another 6%, buildings are 38% of the problem. So I want to posit that the building sector is critical to decarbonization. It's also the sloppiest sector of energy use. We use huge amounts of fossil fuel and electricity. And this is a study of New York City retail, hotels, office buildings. And you'll see that there's an 800% differential in energy use in retail per square foot in different buildings across the city of New York. They've been benchmarking, one of the longest cities to benchmark, and it's amazing how much waste there is in our buildings. There's so much waste that over 600 firms have signed a 2030 commitment across the United States. And this is HOK's performance report. Since they signed the commitment back in 2011, they have achieved close to a 60% reduction in every building they design. And these are reductions, they're simulated reductions, but they actually follow through in measurement and every major retrofit they do. So we have potential, great opportunity and great accomplishment. In addition to that, it's the cheapest carbon savings we have. Everyone's talking about carbon capture and storage, which is up on the right side of this chart from McKinsey. It's a modification update of McKinsey's study. They think the solution is going to be in somehow burying our trash, which is the CO2 that we're putting in the atmosphere and putting it into water, into earth. And yet there is huge opportunity to reduce the demand, which is all the left side of the equation, which actually make great financial sense. And we really need to make those investments. We need to invest in zero energy new homes and commercial buildings. We have 5.7 quads. We need to reduce 50 quads of energy by 2050. We need to drop from where we are now. We can't let it go up. We have to keep pushing it down until we're at least 50 quads less than where we are. And 5.7 of those quads can come through buildings. Another 5 to 6 quads can come through specifying the right products, appliances, and energy equipment efficiency. Another 4 quads can happen through district energy systems. We have great potential to do combined heat, cooling, and power in both new and existing communities. This one in Stockholm. We can get about 4 quads out of existing homes and commercial buildings. And while we're doing that, we will provide jobs, which are critically needed, and we will address inequities, which is critically needed. So this is a really important area for providing social gain in addition to carbon reduction. And we need to look at intelligence. And there's no question that the Internet of Things and data analytics is transforming the way we understand buildings and allowing us to save energy just purely through control systems, and about 3.5 quads through that. And then it looks as if we're going to be doing deep electrification in the built environment. And we have the potential to do innovation in the process of doing electrification. But remember, conservation is always first. It doesn't make sense to just put a big machine into an inefficient house. You should make an efficient house and then put a small machine in. Finally, the carbon sequestration role. The built environment has something to offer here. We can actually sequester carbon by encapsulating CO2 and putting it into concrete. We can actually sequester carbon by growing our building materials, which is why there's such an interest in wood. So in conclusion, buildings have a critical role in electricity generation, in peak load management, in energy storage, and certainly in demand reduction. And when we do this, we will in fact deal with a lot of inequity. It is a serious problem in today's communities. And I'm going to leave you these charts after the talk to look at a little bit more in detail. UT has set a goal of 20% reduction from their base year of 2009 in their energy consumption in buildings. They should be far more strident. Make them set a 50% goal. The design professions can meet it. This report from the National Academy is available for you to download. It absolutely represents a carbon tax at about $40 per metric ton. It clearly recommends green jobs, of which the built environment is a critical portion of it, a green bank, clean energy RD&D, maybe a GI Bill for education that allows clean energy to become an educational solution for a lot of people who don't have access to education, and then energy efficiency, block grants, and weatherization. With that, I close out. Thank you for the opportunity to give you my position.
Thank you, Vivian, for that summary of mitigation opportunities in the building sector. So next, we'll turn it over to Ryan Weiser.
Thanks. Yeah, Ryan Weiser here, and good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. In my opening remarks, focusing exclusively on the U.S. power sector. In particular, I'm going to quickly summarize some new research that was actually just published earlier this morning. New research that on the one hand demonstrates that the U.S. power sector has already made tremendous progress in decarbonization. but that we also have a long ways to go and a heck of a lot of work ahead in our journey towards a net zero sector. Starting with the first key point on the next slide. 15 years ago, most business as usual forecasts projected that US power sector CO2 emissions would reach roughly 3,000 million metric tons by the year 2020. In fact, in the year 2020, the power sector emitted 1,450 million metric tons, 52% below the projected value. Based on that measure, the US power sector in 2020 was already halfway to zero emissions and did so in 15 years. How do we do it? Well, as shown on this infographic, electricity demand reduction, buildings included, was a significant part of that storyline. 24% less electricity demand than projected in the year 2020. Renewables outperformed expectations. Wind and solar combined delivered 13 times more electric power than projected in the year 2020. Nuclear continues to churn out 20% of our total generation nuclear free. And of course, everyone understands that natural gas prices and as a consequence, natural gas electricity generation have increased substantially. It's important to recognize as well that we've received a number of co-benefits associated with this carbon reduction. Total US electric bills are 18% lower in 2020 than was earlier projected. Health damages down 92% relative to projections, and power supply related jobs up by 29%. Next slide. So we've made tremendous progress, but completing the second half of the journey isn't going to be easy. It's going to require beating business as usual projections again. It will also require a somewhat different roadmap than the one that we have employed over the last 15 years. Next slide. So what do we know about the pathway ahead? Well, said plainly, the study that Vivian just described, but a variety of other studies also clearly indicate that in the US power sector in the very near term, we need to go big on solar, wind, and storage. Moreover, those same studies tend to find that in concert with aggressive energy efficiency and existing low carbon resources like hydropower and nuclear, that we can get anywhere from 70 to 90% zero carbon shares and do so at relatively limited additional costs. It's also important to recognize that the market is validating some of these study findings. Wind, solar, and batteries have all come down their learning curves substantially in recent years. And indeed, for wind and solar, the learning curve has in fact accelerated over recent years. In addition, we have 660 gigawatts of wind and solar, and an additional 200 gigawatts of storage sitting in transmission interconnection queues. These are admittedly early stage developments, but illustrate the degree of commercial interest in deploying three of the critical pillars to a decarbonized power sector. Next slide, please. All of that being said, I don't want to leave you with a false sense of either security or surety. Humans, after all, do have a rather poor record in predicting energy transitions. Let's not fool ourselves. A little bit of humility is appropriate. And even if wind, solar, and batteries are to serve as a backbone of near-term decarbonization, scaling those resources is a non-trivial challenge. With a number of those challenges listed here, in the interest of time, I will not go over them. Now, to Vivian's opening remarks, I think it is also crucial to recognize that energy efficiency can very much reduce the scale of these growth challenges. Energy efficiency doesn't eliminate those challenges, but can certainly help address them. As well, ultimately, we'll need to confront the final 10, 20, 30% gap, a gap that will require a different set of technologies than wind, solar, and shorter duration batteries currently provide. So can we achieve deep decarbonization in the power sector? Absolutely. We've already made considerable progress therein, and we have a wide variety of technologies that can get us deeply lower emissions than we are today. That being said, I think it's also crucial that we not understate the challenges. There are a variety of scale-up challenges that are significant in their scope and measure. And with that, I will close. Thanks, Ben.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. It's pretty amazing to see the progress in recent years in the electricity sector specifically. So our final panelist, Vijay Swarup, you're up now.
Well, it's great. Thank you, Ben and Vivian, Ryan. It's an honor to be on this panel with you. And I'm going to try to build off of what's already been said and try to minimize duplication. But what I do want to talk about is the future and the challenges we have. So if you advance the slide, please. We've already talked a lot this, but let's keep this real simple. Energy is essential. And while we take it for granted, there are many people in this world who don't even know what access to energy means. And the chart on the left simply shows that, which is UN Human Development Index on the y-axis and energy on the x-axis. And you can see that for the developed nations, we tend to be in the upper right, and the developing nations aspire to be in the upper right. That's part one of the challenge. The good news is, as you've heard from Vivian and Ryan, there's lots of energy sources, which in itself is technology advancement. The ability to have oil and gas in the US, the solar, the wind, etc. Lots of technologies have been able to provide ample energy. The challenge, other half of the challenge, is on the right, which is we want to do this while reducing emissions. This becomes the dual challenge. And you can see on the right side, building off of Vivian and Ryan, you can see the various sectors. And as they both already pointed out, these are not discrete sectors. There is huge overlap between the sectors. And so the challenge, which starts as a 2x2 dynamic, becomes very complicated very quickly. And that's what we call the dual challenge. How do we improve living standards while reducing emissions? Now, if you go to the next chart, this builds off beautifully off of what Ryan and Vivian have talked about. This is work, the next slide, please. Thank you. Is work the IEA produced, which shows of the 40 technology areas that we think are needed, 34 are not on track. That doesn't mean progress isn't being made. It simply means that we are at that fork in the road. We are at that point where we need to accelerate technology development, and you can see them across the various sectors. I won't read them. If you go to the next slide, though, I'm going to postulate what can we do about this. I'm going to start by saying, how do we do it today? As you all know, technology development and energy, the scale, the capital, the infrastructure, translates to lots of time. What we need to do is on the front end of this is we have to accelerate the development. We do things in a linear fashion today. We go from discovery to development to first deployment to deployment at scale. That can take years, if not decades, to go from concept to scale. How do we do that differently? Next slide. We think collaboration is key. This is a tremendous panel. We have a national lab, we have a university, and we have large industry. Those are really three of the key ingredients to get there. Universities spend a lot of time on fundamentals, understanding the principles. The national labs provide capabilities to go to the next scale. Smaller companies we work with like Synthetic Genomics, Global Thermostat, they can do first deployment. Companies like ours, large project expertise, large capital, ability to take things at scale. Now, what we need to do is we need to start, instead of linear, we need to work in collaboration. So we want to work with universities, we want to work with national labs, we want to work with smaller companies, all with the point of how do we get there faster? How do we envision the pathway to scale? How do we shape the research to help us address the scalable questions, which can often be identified early on, but are often not addressed until later in the pipeline? And that's the challenge. So we think, as we hit this fork in the road, this is a technology gap. We need to accelerate technology, everything Vivian and Ryan have already said. We need to change not just what we're working on, but how we're working on it. And this slide here shows you ways that we can change the how, which I think is going to be critical to acceleration. So with that, thank you, Ben. I'll turn it back over to you to moderate the panel.
Thanks, Vijay. So a lot of very thought-provoking ideas there to get us started in our Q&A here. So my first question is going to be directed at Ryan because it's about the electricity sector. And you presented just how much progress is being made, significant progress on reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the US power sector, especially due to the rapid growth of wind and solar, really outpacing where people thought we would be in 2021. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what were the key ingredients that enabled this success story? And then what can we learn from them for accelerating the development and deployment of technologies that could be similarly successful in other sectors?
Yeah, so I think there are obviously lots of ingredients for how we got to this point that are inclusive of energy efficiency, renewable energy, nuclear, and natural gas. One of the notable ones that I want to emphasize, because I think that it does hold promise for the future as well, is to really focus on deployment-oriented learning. You know, one of the reasons that we've been so successful with solar, with wind, with increasingly battery technologies, with LED lighting as well, is that we've come down very aggressive cost curves in all cases. So what are the common threads of those particular technologies? They're technologies for which we have supported the deployment. We've supported the deployment at scale. And to some degree, they're manufactured goods. They're not one-off singular power plants, each of which is designed completely anew. And so as we think about the pathway ahead, which will require a variety of new technologies, trying to identify how to get on that deeply declining cost curve for electrolysis, for long duration storage, for a lot of technologies that were on that list that Vijay shared is going to be really crucial. And so again, getting that deployment oriented learning going, making sure that the scale of the deployment and the scope and surety of the deployment over a period of years is sufficient to get the manufacturing scale up necessary, I think is a real important lesson from the history of the last 20 years or so.
Mm-hmm. So Vivian, maybe you could comment on similar issues in the building sector. So we've had a lot of success in some building end uses. Say lighting comes to mind, but probably less success in others. So yeah, I'm curious your thoughts on the building sector.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Ryan's right. And LBNL was central to LED developments and to refrigerator efficiency. And these are huge consumer items that are not just bought in this country at rapid rates, but bought around the world. So it has been a critical contribution to greenhouse gas reduction. There are some really interesting innovations, I think, in terms of distributed energy, buildings that actually generate electricity, materials, window materials that might in fact generate. There's some real innovations that might allow items that we're going to invest in anyways become an alternative source. And buildings are actually very good batteries, not chemical batteries. They're actually batteries in terms of asynchronous energy loads and the ability to store cooling, store heating. So I think there's some real opportunity in the built environment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So my next question here is directed toward Vijay. So you mentioned this dual challenge of simultaneously trying to address energy poverty around the world, bring the entire global population up to sort of first world living standards, while dealing with climate change. So it seems to me that a key aspect of this energy transition on a global level is trying to help these developing nations where emissions are expected to grow, try to leapfrog sort of to less environmentally harmful technologies than the technologies that we've used in the past. So maybe, for example, people's first automobile purchase will be an EV as opposed to a vehicle that uses gasoline. So from your perspective, what are really the prospects for technology leapfrogging in the developing world? Are there sectors where you expect that to happen, or sectors where you think that might be more difficult?
Well, that's a great question, Ben. And the first thing I would say to that is we have to remember that this is as technical an industry as there is. Energy encompasses every science and engineering at scales that are unmatched. So we are always on a technology evolution. So this concept of leapfrogging is as important as starting from where we are today and then moving forward and not starting with what was done in the past. So I do think as you look across all the sectors, there are opportunities to to move faster. So if you think about the power sector, if you build a power plant and you incorporate carbon capture, you have already started. You're not retrofitting anymore. You're imagining what you need in the future. As you think about the grid, you have to incorporate enough power, as Vivian pointed out. You have to be designing your power grid big enough to be able to handle all the additional power load that will come as you electrify cars, as you do those other things. The industrial sector, which is often not spoken about, which is a very large emitter. If you remember that chart that I showed, there you need to think about, well, the role of hydrogen and the role of electrifying even the industrial sector, which requires new technology. So I think what you have to do is you have to start with the problem. As we all know from university days, stating the problem is half the battle. So if the problem is we need to simultaneously do it, as you pointed out, Ben, then we need to look at the technology gaps, and we need to imagine by geography, because the other thing about energy is it's a global challenge solved regionally. And so you have to think about what the regional aspects are. Ryan did that very well for the US. It'll be a different set of solutions for India. And we have to think about that, think about the technologies, build off of where we are, and then anticipate. So much of what we need to do in this space is anticipating and then driving the breakthroughs to close the gaps that we have. But that's exactly what needs to happen.
Anyone else want to respond?
Yeah, I'd like to add a very different perspective or a different idea to this, which is the resiliency challenge of electric grids in developing countries. Developing countries, I mean, clearly they can leapfrog us in highly efficient appliances, in electrification of vehicles and other commodities that they are starting to buy. But where I think the real contribution to the Western society is going to be from the developing world is, how do you design the built environment to be resilient when the grid goes down? And it's through deep conservation and passive conditioning with just-in-time electricity use, not continuous electricity. We don't need to air condition a building when no one's in it just because we're in a 7x24 operating mode, right? So the whole notion of cooling the room that you're in, which you see in the developing world and don't see in the American context, is something I think is going to be it's a two-way street. We have a lot to learn from the developing world.
Yeah, and I guess I would just also add that where the leapfrogging, I think, holds the greatest potential is where you have very long-lived assets. As Vivian well knows, it's a lot harder to retrofit an existing building to be super energy efficient than to build a new building in that form or fashion. Similarly, if you're building a power plant that will last for 30 years, really thinking about a solar or wind plus storage solution up front buys you time. And so especially when we're talking about these especially long-lived assets, I do think those are the areas where this leapfrogging concept is of greatest value. And all of us could come up with plenty of examples throughout the energy sector where long-lived assets can profitably be thought of very differently today than 10 or 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thank you. So I'll stick with you, Ryan, and ask a question about the continued decarbonization of electricity. So as you sort of laid out, in the near future, we can continue to decarbonize more wind, more solar, and that'll get us, maybe quite a bit of the way. But as we start to approach net zero emissions, those last emissions reductions could become harder to achieve. So what do you see as the key gaps in existing technology that really need to be addressed if we're going to get actually close to net zero emissions in the power sector?
Yeah, so let me riff on a slightly different question first, Ben, and then I'll get to your question as well. So the first thing that I think we need to acknowledge is that I think that there's oftentimes this perspective that it's harder to get new technology than to deploy existing technology. I think that's to some degree arguable. I mean, ultimately, we need to deploy wind and solar at much more rapid pace than we have historically. And the challenges of doing so in terms of maintaining reliability, ensuring that we have the institutions that enable new transmission, designing the planning and operating environment for the power system to efficiently integrate wind and solar without causing trouble, addressing with land use and ecosystem concerns, very real concerns for wind and solar, addressing impacted communities. I mean, these are all really hard things. In some cases, I might prefer a new technology challenge, actually, than the institutional and policy and human challenges of scaling. So let me just accept that first. Yes, we have the 3 technologies that we need to reduce power sector carbon emissions by another 70 to 90% in wind, solar, and storage in the US, where we're very well endowed with those particular resources. Other countries are not as well endowed, let me be very clear. As well, that last 10%, or 20% or 30%, the studies differ as to where that break point hits, clearly needs another solution. All of us intuitively understand that relying on solar, wind, and short duration batteries, there are going to be plenty of times of the year where we're going to be left wanting for power if that's our ultimate solution. So we will need on-demand resources. In the near term, that may simply come from natural gas power plants that are run at very low, much lower duty cycles. But if we're really striving for net zero, we're going to need another set of technologies. Maybe that's very long duration storage. Maybe that's flexible, small modular nuclear reactors. Maybe that's fossil generation with CCS that is run flexibly. Maybe that's hydrogen. Maybe it's hydrogen even run in existing, though retrofitted natural gas power plants. There's a variety of technologies there. None of them are at scale, but many of them could serve that last remaining 10, 20, 30% part of the picture. And clearly we're going to need to make progress on one, or ideally more than one, of those technology solutions to manage the remaining challenges, both in the US and overseas, where in some countries, again, they're not as well endowed with wind and solar, and they may need to confront a different set of challenges with a different set of solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So one thing you mentioned there, Ryan, which really interested me, is this distinction between developing new technologies and then deploying existing ones. So I'm going to pivot back to Vivian in thinking about the building sector, where for many years those editions of the McKinsey cost curves have suggested that there are all of these mitigation opportunities in the building sector that essentially pay for themselves. So it might be better insulation or moving to CFLs or LED lighting. Yet, even though these technologies exist, for whatever reason, it seems like consumers don't always adopt them. So what do you see as the main challenges to deploying the existing technologies that are available in the building sector? And from a policy formulation perspective, what types of policies should we think about to accelerate the diffusion of these technologies?
A really good question. It's typically a capital problem, and a turnover problem. You don't buy a house boiler more than once every 25 to 50 years. You try to keep your home heating system running without replacing it for very long periods of time. And when you do replace it, it's usually a crisis moment where you'll take whatever's on the shelf, no matter what. So we do need codes and standards that make sure that the only thing that's on the shelf is a highly efficient electric system. We should not be essentially selling things that are no longer part of our future energy story. But we're probably going to have to subsidize. And there's 2 ways to subsidize. One is to make it a jobs bill, where you really actually say if deep efficiency is an employment opportunity, and it addresses inequity, and it improves our infrastructure as a nation. And the other is you do carbon trading. You put some sort of value on saving energy, because these are the cheapest investments with the greatest payback. And so the combination of standards, energy banks, jobs, and carbon trading, I think, will absolutely put buildings back in the forefront.
So then, Vijay, on a similar note, another class of technologies that has been available, but we don't see actually starting to be deployed very much, is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And that's one where we actually have had federal policy to encourage people to start deploying it. So what do you see as the main barriers to scaling up carbon capture, utilization, and storage? And what are the applications where you think that it really should play a major role in decarbonization?
Yeah, that's a great question. If I could summarize what Vivian and Ryan have been saying to point, it is This is a scale challenge. It's a technology challenge. It's a policy challenge. It's an infrastructure challenge. And to answer your carbon capture question, there is technology. It requires infrastructure. It requires policies around the infrastructure. It requires, encouraging the investment, because again, as Ryan and Vivian have pointed out, the capital requirements for this are pretty intense. And again, and then you have the challenge about the retrofit versus new. To Ryan's point, one additional thing I'll say on carbon capture to build off of what Ryan and Vivian said is, at some point, a negative carbon technology is likely going to be needed, and there's a lot of research going on in direct air capture, ourselves included, because direct air capture, of course, takes the CO2 out of the air. Now, as you know, concentrations in the air are much harder, so it needs different types of materials and different types of process engineering. But I think one of the things that's coming out of this panel loud and clear is that there is no singular solution. There's going to be you need a long technology array. You need a large array of options. Those are going to be geographically dependent. They're going to be dependent upon infrastructure and policy as well. And in research, what we're focusing on is options. And what we're trying to do, Ben, is we're trying to accelerate the speed at which we can take options to scale. And I think that's one way to close this gap. There's no singular way to close the gap, but one way to close the gap is to get technologies off faster on, whether you use Ryan's words, which you're getting them on the experience curve, get them on the deployment curve, or in my world, which is how do you get them ready to be deployed faster. Both are going to have to be needed. And, these panels are very encouraging because we're having the right discussion. This is a discussion about inclusion, about including ideas and advancing ideas, rather than prematurely kind of picking a single idea, because there won't be a singular solution here.
Mm-hmm. So I guess I'll just sort of open up more generally on that same theme of policy approaches for trying to accelerate technology development and deployment. So, of course, there's this lingering question of whether in the United States we'll have some kind of carbon tax or an effective carbon price as is present in other regions in the world. So I'm curious, even if we did get to a point where we had a real federal climate policy like that covering the whole economy, what other policy instruments do you think would be needed to complement that? So for example, there might be other market failures that need to be addressed around innovation, around consumer information. Vivian mentioned sort of capital requirements for investing in new technologies. So what other complementary policies do you think should really remain part of the US's approach to technology pathways to decarbonization as we move forward? So maybe Ryan, I'll start with you.
Well, I think that you hit a key one, Ben: innovation policies, R&D, early deployment, getting through the valley of death, all those sorts of things are going to be really crucial. All of that said, I'm also, I don't know, that the concept that let's posit that we have an economy-wide carbon tax or cap and trade type policy. What other complementary policies do we need? I mean, that's a fine academic frame, but we've been talking about an economy-wide carbon price for a long time. I don't see a whole lot of evidence that Congress is going to take up an economy-wide carbon policy in the near term, at least as it relates to a carbon tax or cap and trade. And so to some extent, I would want to reframe your question about not positing that we have a carbon policy that is a tax or cap and trade. What complementary policies do we need? But perhaps instead, what other policies can serve the bill? If we don't have a comprehensive economy-wide price on carbon, what are the other things that we can employ in order to support this transition? May not be the optimal first best neoclassical economist set of options, but it may be the only practical set of options from a political and policy perspective. And if I were to riff on that for just a brief moment, I think it's pretty clear in the power sector that something like a clean energy standard is certainly one of the important arrows in the quiver, as it were we to try to progress down the continued decarbonization curve apace in the years ahead.
So at this point, I'm going to move into some of the great questions I'm seeing that have been submitted by our audience members. So the first question that I'd like to pose is a question about how to think about the life cycle emissions associated with supply chains for various technologies. So for example, mining some of the minerals that are used in new energy technologies, shipping these products around the world, or in Vivian's sector of buildings, how to think about the embedded emissions in building materials. So yeah, maybe Vijay, do you want to maybe
I'd love to.
About how you think about that?
Ben, that is so critical that we have a system to be able to understand the full life cycle or the full CO2 footprint of an energy pathway. And while that sounds easy, it is actually, as you point out, quite complicated, because we often talk about just one subsector of the entire pathway, and every piece has to be accounted for. And in fact, there's some outstanding work being done at places like MIT, where they are developing energy pathway life cycle tools. Ryan, you know that within the national labs, there's several energy pathway tools. And I think what we need to do is we need to really start speaking a common language when it comes to systems and measurements, and start talking about the full life cycle assessment of an energy pathway, because that is the only true way to do it. And as engineers and scientists, which I think is what you largely have on this, certainly on this panel and probably in this room, it is also something that we can relate to. This is a material balance that you have to go from, whether you want to use well to wheel or cradle to grave or whatever phrase you want to use. But what that does is it not only allows you to understand the true carbon footprint of your options, but quite frankly, it informs some of the things that you've been talking about, which is where should we focus our innovation? What are the areas where we have technical solutions and it's a factor of deploying? Okay, that's one set. Where do we have a technology gap? And how do we drive innovation to close that energy gap? These tools, these life cycle assessment tools, can really drive that. We strongly believe in them. There's a lot of good work, like I said, going on at MIT and other places, and I think that can really underpin the research and the gap closure that we need to do. That's a great point.
Yeah, I'll jump in there, because this is the cutting edge issue for the building, sort of zero energy building world. As soon as they realize the operational energy challenge of 70% reduction is doable, and 100% literally net energy by 2050, then they began to look at the embodied energy challenge. And there are a whole series of building products that are seriously part of the problem. I mean, concrete, steel, aluminum, yes, insulation, plastics, and we use them with abandon. I mean, we literally, as a profession, we use them with abandon. And so carbon footprinting and actually carbon calculators are beginning to pop up in professional practices and certainly in academia all across the world as people try to get a handle on embodied carbon. And the building sector has the potential certainly to dramatically reduce embodied carbon in the building sector, and maybe even to sequester some carbon.
Yeah, and if I could just add one thing, maybe not so much on the embodied carbon piece, which is obviously crucial now, but as we decarbonize more and more of the sectors of our economy, those embedded carbon emissions will automatically drop at some level. So it's a problem that, at least if we maintain deep decarbonization, it will sort of solve itself. I don't mean that in a very remote kind of way, but in some ways that is true. There are plenty of other materials not related to carbon that we also need to worry about from a supply chain perspective, whether those are critical materials for batteries and wind turbines and solar panels, et cetera. So in addition to thinking about the embedded carbon emissions, really being thoughtful about supply chains, material constraints that might exist either due to physical limitations, institutional limitations, social limitations, et cetera, will also be really important.
So the next question I want to get to, I want to direct toward Ryan, because it concerns electricity generation. So we got two separate questions, one about the future basically of nuclear power, and the other about the future of biomass and biofuels. So I guess with nuclear power, the question is really about, we've been hearing about things like small modular reactors, research on nuclear fusion, these kinds of ideas for many years now, it seems. So from your perspective, what role might or should nuclear power play in the future of the electricity sector? And are the challenges fundamentally just it's very expensive? Or are there other reasons why you think that nuclear might have a difficult time playing a major role? So yeah, basically just about the future of nuclear power. And then I guess, yeah, while you're at it, also biomass. There are some visions of, combining biomass with carbon capture and storage to get basically negative emissions, controllable power. So what do you see about the future of, say, nuclear and biomass relative to the rapid expansion of solar and wind?
I think on the biomass side, which I'll address first because it's maybe slightly less controversial than the first one, if only slightly. I think on biomass within the power sector, certainly BECCS or biomass with CCS, so that you in effect have a negative emissions technology, does hold some promise. But ultimately, the biomass supply does have limits. And we may ultimately choose as a country, as a globe, to focus that available supply in harder to decarbonize sectors of the economy, whether that's bio-derived fuels used for ships and airplanes or in industry, remains to be seen. But I think that biomass it's a valuable and limited commodity within the context of decarbonization. And we have to be thoughtful about where within the broad energy ecosystem we have gaps where it can uniquely fill. And I'm not sure the power sector is that, with the exception maybe of BECCS, where you do benefit from a zero carbon source. On the nuclear front, I don't want to get into all of the safety and public health and just community concerns around nuclear. I do think that one of the big challenges is that if we're going to go big with solar and wind, what that means is that the remaining technology is going to be operated at relatively low utilization rates, right? We have to accept and acknowledge that wind and solar are suboptimal resources at some level. They deliver power at some times and not at others. And so we need technologies. They're not really baseload technologies, but are more flexible technologies. And so I think one of the challenges with respect to nuclear is that it has high capital costs and low operating costs. Whereas if you want a flexible technology, what you would really ideally prefer is one that has low capital costs and potentially higher operating costs, and therefore is more economical if used in a flexible mode.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Ben, if I could just add one thing real quick, right? Because we spent a lot of time talking about power, which is electrons. And I think what Ryan pointed out when you mentioned biomass is the other thing that's needed for energy is a carbon-hydrogen bond. And so you need both. You need CH bonds and you need electrons. And the question really that you've been asking in various forms is, where are you going to get your electrons and where are you going to get your CH bonds? And it's going to be the integration of those two that I think is critical. So biomass obviously is a route, as Ryan points out, to get the CH bonds, to get the energy density you need for the harder to decarbonize areas. And the other thing that Ryan pointed out, which I think is really important, is these are not singular solutions. So there is now combinations. So biomass plus CCS to power. That's the other thing that we need to think about as we rethink about how we innovate and how we drive technologies. We have to look at the intersection of various sectors and various technologies.
So the next question is, I think, a very good high-level one about trying to use policy to purposefully accelerate technology transitions in energy. And that's in thinking about the costs, especially the costs that you might be imposing on consumers. So we talked a little bit earlier about, say, carbon prices versus more granular policies like subsidizing a particular technology. And at least economic theory tells us that some of these policy approaches can be quite expensive, even relative to using, say, a carbon tax or a broader instrument like that. So the question is really about, how do we accelerate technology transitions without imposing large costs on consumers? So whoever asked the question mentioned the specific example of potentially raising the cost of housing by requiring housing to be built with certain materials or technologies that might be more expensive? And then how do you trade that off against problems associated with housing inaffordability? So maybe Vivian, just because of that specific example, you could respond first, but really just in general, thinking about the costs of these policies to accelerate the transition.
Well, let me just start a minute with the LED example that we talked about at the very beginning. LED lamps, the first time they came out, were like $10 a piece. And we were used to spending, 25 cents for an incandescent light bulb, and the notion of spending $10 in LED. But actually, if you do the economics for the homeowner, you actually still make out buying the $10 LED lamp. But once we get to a point where it becomes actually standard practice, where we really actually have a market, the prices of LEDs are down pretty close to, not quite, but pretty close to the price of an old incandescent. So, I think the same was going to be true for the building sector. Right now, to get energy efficient homes built, because it's not standard practice, there are all kinds of cost premiums that are thrown at the buyer. They could be taken out of the profit of the developer, but somehow that never happens. It all just gets passed on to the home buyer. But ultimately, when these become standard practice, I don't think we'll see those cost differentials. We will just have better buildings. And even if there still are cost differentials, you, the buyer who plan to pay those energy bills for the next 10 years and have to replace those light bulbs, remember incandescent light bulbs, you would have to replace them 2 or 3 times a year. And now you've got, 15 years before you're replacing a light bulb. What a difference in the quality of our life. So I'm not completely convinced that the homeowner loses in this process.
I guess the one thing that I would say, Ben, is that, look, decarbonizing the energy ecosystem of the country and the globe, it's not easy. And I wouldn't argue that it's costless either. It imposes some costs. But let us not forget the costs that are imposed if we take no action at all. And so I think that it's standard practice for us energy geeks to think about, well, what's the payback of this LED light bulb? How much additional cost is imposed by going wind and solar and batteries versus cheap natural gas? And that's fine. We should pay attention to the cost. Costs matter, and they should continue to matter. But again, let us not forget the significant societal costs that will be imposed upon our country and the globe were we not to act.
Well, and I think what Vivian and you guys, you both you have to accelerate the experience curve. So you have to understand whether the experience curve is being driven by numbering it up, by making more of the same thing, or by making it bigger. And then trying to understand the technologies and the technology gaps and drive that. I'm biased towards technical, but getting the technologies on the map and the experience curve decline so that we can get to where we need to get to.
So a question for you, Vijay. So you mentioned, right, that some of this is a story about electricity and how we need electrons. But there are some sectors where electrification seems particularly challenging, and maybe where the answer isn't electrification with solar, wind, and storage, but other forms of energy delivered to the point of end use. So if we think about things like industry or maybe marine or marine transportation or aviation, things like that. So for some of these difficult to electrify and therefore difficult to decarbonize sectors, what do you see as the most promising solutions? We've already talked about carbon capture. There's also things like bioenergy or hydrogen. So what do you see as the most likely strategies in those sectors?
Yeah, I think it's, again, no singular strategy. I think you have to recognize that, as I said earlier, an electron and a CH bond, those are the things you need. And for some of these heavier to decarbonize sectors, what you really need is energy density, as you all know. And that comes from a liquid hydrocarbon. And so now the question is, how do you get the liquid hydrocarbon, and how do you take the CO2 out of the liquid hydrocarbon? And so there's a couple of approaches that I'll postulate. One is a bio-forward approach, which, again, I understand the challenges around the availability of the feed, et cetera, but a biomaterial will get you the carbon hydrogen bond. Things like algae, other things that can be grown at scale can get you a biofuel. And then, of course, there's the other side of the equation, which is the CO2 out of the air, which is the direct air capture, or the natural sinks, which I think Vivian referenced earlier. So either of those can get you on the back end. So, you know, Ben, I think it's a question of understanding the sector demands, what type of energy is required. So you have a demand array, understanding your technology array, what technologies can meet that demand, and then working the iteration between the two so that we can understand what's going on. And I think what you're going to find early on, as I pointed out in the slide where I showed the technologies that are behind the deployment rate, is we have technology gaps. And then let's bring it full circle and say that's where we need to direct our innovation. We need to close the gaps where the gaps are the biggest. And those are the ones that can be done through collaboration, through different mechanisms to inspire the innovation that's going to be required.
So my last question, just looking at the amount of time we have left, where I'd love to get a quick answer from each of our panelists. So, you know, earlier this morning in this conference, Varun Rai and then Ben Sovakul presented some data on historical energy transitions, just showing how long they tend to be. So multiple decades, you know, even century kind of timescales. So I guess the question is, are you optimistic or pessimistic that we can actually get to net zero emissions by 2050, and why? So Ryan?
Oh, darn it, I have to go first on this one.
No pressure.
I guess I'm optimistic that we could get, if not to net zero, at least close to net zero with scaling up many of the technologies we have today, and with very significant progress on a large number of other technologies, inclusive of some net negative technologies like direct air capture. I don't think that there's anything in history that tells us that a transition has to take a century. As I mentioned in my little opening remarks, in the power sector at least, we've reduced emissions more or less in half over a 15-year period. You know, all of that said, it's also clear that the real world does not operate like an energy optimization model. And so looking at an AGU paper, looking at a Princeton paper that shows that an economy-wide optimization model can solve the problem is not the same as actually solving the problem. And so clearly there is going to be just an enormous amount of work on technology development, on building out these intersectoral linkages, on deploying technologies at scales in which they have never been deployed before. So could we do it? Yep, I think we could, but it's going to require an all hands on deck kind of situation. Vivian?
Yeah, I think I'm also optimistic, but I'm only optimistic if we understand that demand has to go down. We cannot just assume that we're going to continue to cruise along at the demand rate and much less demand growth and meet it with better, more renewable energy sources. And I'm afraid that there's a lot of emphasis on the idea of if we can just come up with all the right sources, business as usual can continue. And in the demand reduction side, I mean, there's a really important message about using the right type of energy for the right outcome. I mean, we need electricity to run our computers. We don't need electricity necessarily to heat and cool. We can use geothermal energies to heat and cool. We can use natural energies. We can use night cooling to heat and cool. We can use daylight for lighting instead of electric light. I mean, there is so much that natural energies that we are totally underutilizing in our demand equation that we should be playing to the hilt, and maybe learning from the developing world who just didn't have the energy resources to displace them. But I'm very optimistic as long as demand gets a real push and a real commitment.
Yeah, look, real quick, I remain optimistic as well, but I'm also a realist. I think I'm optimistic because I think we can drive it with technology. I think we need to innovate. I think we need to collaborate in ways we haven't done before. But I'm realistic that this is a decades-long problem, and particularly if you think about globally. And I think we just have to be pragmatic in the scale and the capital and the time that's going to be required. What we need to do first is focus on technologies. That's the fork in the road. And we need to get the technologies on the pathway. And then we need to move as quickly and as expeditiously as we can.
So with that, I want to thank all three panelists for this fascinating discussion. And just make a couple quick announcements. So because there was a question about whether the slides from the presentations will be available, we will make those available at energyweek.utexas.edu after the conference is over. And now we'll have a 30-minute lunch break, followed at 1 p.m. by the next panel, which is on sustaining the transition, a new social contract. And that panel will be moderated by David Spence. So thanks again to all of our panelists. I really enjoyed the discussion.
It was great.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Super.